Hello, and thank you for joining me today on The Political Conversationalist. My name is Ben Phipps, and we're talking about divisive issues. Now, last time we talked about abortion. It's a long video. It's a very complex issue. I gave what I think should be done. You guys fed back or gave me feedback. Thanks for all that. Today we're talking about another controversial issue. This one's in the news more in America now. That's gun control. So there are many different stances on gun control, and I'm going to narrow this down to the side that thinks we should have more control and the side that thinks we should either stay where we are or have less control. Kind of try to show you both sides of that. So firstly, the side that say we should have more gun control. They cite some really telling statistics. Gun deaths in the U.S. are 11.6 per 100,000. Versus the UK is 0.22 people per 100,000, and in Australia it's 1.04 people per 100,000. So yes, there are a lot more gun deaths in the US. However, that includes suicides and accidents. They also say that to stop mass shootings and things, we should ban assault weapons. And we've had 17 mass shootings that in the last 35 years that have used an AR-15 style rifle. And there are also people who want to ban magazines with a greater than 10 round capacity. And another common push is that people should be analyzed mentally before being allowed to purchase a gun. So like a mental health assessment by a qualified physician. And they also point out that the Second Amendment says arms, not small arms, not rifles, not guns. And that can be applied to any type of weapon whatsoever. So if you want a nuclear submarine, you should be able to buy one if we're literally taking the Constitution word for word. But since we have common sense, no one's buying a nuclear submarine. That makes a little sense. Now, from the people who say we should have less gun control or stay where we are as far as the laws are, they cite things like, well, it's my constitutional right. The Second Amendment says I have the right to keep and bear arms, and I don't have to tell anybody why, and nobody can take them away from me. That's probably the most common argument. They also say that a well-armed public will prevent governmental tyranny, which should the government become tyrannical, I would probably think it would be better for the individual to run and hide than try to make a stand with an AR-15, but I digress on that. They also point out that, yes, the gun death rate is high, but that does include suicides and accidents, and the murder rate is actually not that bad. The murder rate is 4.5 per 100,000 people in the U.S., whereas in Russia it's 12.5, and in Mexico it's 22 people. So that's a pretty telling statistic. Although there are a lot of gun deaths, many of those are suicides. It's probably one of the fastest ways to commit suicide, and that's why people choose it. Most gun deaths are handgun deaths. So assault weapons bans really wouldn't have a massive impact on actual gun deaths in America, and it's just kind of demonizing the military-looking weapon. Now, when they say assault weapons, they normally mean AR-15s or AK-47s or, well, you know, AKMs or whatever. They're civilian versions of these military-looking weapons. That's normally what they mean. But most gun murders, by and large, in the U.S. are with handguns. The statistic I could find is that handgun deaths in 2013 were 5,782, compared to rifle deaths in 2013 were 285. So many times more prevalent to be, or many times more statistically probable that you would be killed with a handgun than with a rifle. To the people who say that there needs to be a mental health analysis, the people on the side who say there shouldn't be cite that the fact is that insanity is not a medical term. Insanity is a legal term, which means you cannot legally tell right from wrong. And the mental incompetence would be determined by whoever the government didn't want to have guns. So should the government become tyrannical, they could just say, well, people that believe in talking to someone you can't see and asking him for things because magic, you know, like people who pray. I know that sounded horrible, I pray, but that'd be a way you could put it. Those people are crazy and they don't need guns. So they say that mentally incompetent people are whoever the government says is mentally incompetent, and that's why they don't agree with that type of law. And then in practical enforcement, they say that it would be impractical to enforce any new gun legislation because there are 270 million guns in the U.S. There's 88.1 guns per 100 people. So, I mean, it's going to be really difficult. Now, if you take into account all the different magazines, all the different rounds of ammunition, it would be very difficult to say, well, we're going to ban 10-round magazines, because there are millions of them floating around. You know, there are millions of AR-15 magazines and AK-47 magazines in the States. If you're going to say, well, these are illegal, barring kicking in people's doors and checking to see if they have them, it's going to be impossible to really police that. You could prevent the sale of new ones, but there are enough here to last for a very long time. Magazines don't wear out super quickly. So now I'm going to tell you what I think about it. Now, gun control and communism, if you watched our communism video, and socialism to a certain extent, those are all good arguments in a perfect world. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a crime-ridden world. We live in a world of selfishness and hate and racism and greed. And because of that, these perfect world arguments don't work. Now, if we lived in a utopia with no crime, with no government, and, you know, a communist utopia where nothing bad ever happened, everybody always had what they needed, nobody stole things, there was no gangs, no drugs, yeah, sure, I don't need guns at that point, because I don't need to, you know, protect myself. I don't need a gun for any reason. I mean, maybe recreational hunting or target shooting, but other than that, why? You can go ahead and have them at that point. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world with lots of murder, lots of rape, lots of burglary, lots of violent crime, and people feel that they have a need for a gun because of that. Now, I'm on the side, and I don't like to take a side directly. I tried to be kind of fair in the last video on abortion, but I am on the side that there shouldn't be any more laws on gun control right now. The reason I say right now is because there are multiple ways, and we'll discuss this in the future, that the government could become very, very corrupt very, very quickly. Now, I'm not saying get a tinfoil hat and get ready for 1984, but it's very possible. And because of that, there's very little transparency in government, especially when it comes to where their money comes from. You don't have to tell anyone. That's the Chase Bank Act, I believe, of 2004. We'll discuss that in detail in a later video. But the government is very, very shady and underhanded, and you can't tell everything that they're doing. So I'm reluctant to give up my gun on that. Of course, I'm also reluctant to give up my guns because I have a wife who's pregnant, I have a dog, I have parents, she has parents. You know, I'm sure my dog has parents, I don't know where they are. But, you know, we have people we want to protect, and I feel comfortable in my fighting ability. I feel comfortable in the fact that I might have a baseball bat and do a pretty good job with that, you know. But by and large, since there are so many guns in America, if I'm going to get robbed or assaulted, it might be with a gun. And the only way to get to an even playing field is to have a gun of my own. So for self-defense reasons, I like to have a gun, and I'm in the process of getting my concealed carry permit in North Carolina. What I would like to point out, though, especially because the mass shootings are what's in the news so much. First off, don't trust all mass shooting statistics. A lot of times gang shootouts and any shooting in which more than 4 people get shot is considered a mass shooting, which is not the same thing. If 2 gangs go at it, 5 people get shot and go to the hospital, it's not the same thing as the Parkland shooting. It's just not. Speaking of the Parkland shooting, if the original laws were followed correctly, it would have never happened. Because the Parkland shooter was referred to the FBI many times as being a violent, racist person, which is strange because he wasn't really white. But he was a violent, racist person. The FBI, I believe, got reports on him twice and buried it. Never looked into it, didn't care, didn't have the time, just did what they wanted to do. And because of that, he was able to legally buy a rifle and do what he did. Now, the Sutherland Springs shooter was the same exact way. In the state of Texas, you know, if you were forcibly mentally institutionalized, which he was, you can't own a firearm. If you were dishonorably discharged from the military, which he was, you can't own a firearm. And if you've ever had a violent conviction, such as assault or sexual assault or something like that, then you can't own a firearm. He had all 3, and because states and counties and the federal government don't cooperate like they should, no one cared and sold him the guns anyway. So the point I'm trying to get at is this. Firstly, to stop shootings, to stop mass shootings, the best thing to do would be to make sure the people that are buying guns can legally buy them. When, you know, of course, when you go to buy a gun, they do a background check. They call your county sheriff's department, and they run a state check. I believe it ought to be, and it is illegal for states not to report to the federal system, but I believe it ought to be punished more so, because if I committed a crime in Arizona and tried, convicted, and let's say it was assault, and I only did like 4 months. I did 4 months of time, Arizona, came back out to North Carolina. I bought a gun. Have you ever committed a violent crime? Nope. They're going to call where I live in North Carolina. Chances are, if I was not in Phoenix, Arizona, or Tucson, or a giant, you know, city, they're not going to report it. And I'm going to be able to come over here and buy a gun. That kind of thing happens a lot more than you think. So we really need to enforce the laws we have on the books. We need to get rid of the laziness and the bureaucracy between the county, states, and federal governments so that everybody can work together and we will know who can legally buy a gun and who can't. Now also, I think we need to be very much so more transparent in government. Then I wouldn't have a problem giving up assault weapons, as they like to call them. But until then, I don't see a problem with them. One last point, and it's a tenuous point at that, is that I like having guns because should the very absolutely worst happen, the U.S. be invaded by a foreign power, I think it would be better really to cover my retreat. I wouldn't try to make a stand with my pregnant wife, but it would be better to cover my retreat with something like an AR-15 or even a lever action 1860 Henry, as opposed to something like a brick or a fireman's axe. So that's something that it's a very rare occurrence. It's probably never going to happen, but if it did, that's also a good reason to have that kind of sense of security. Anyway, I hope I presented both sides fairly well, gave you some good statistics, hope you learned something. Hope you understood what I was talking about, my beliefs and what should be done. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.